Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to celebrating 125 years, a special webinar honoring the Canadian Forest Service, hosted by the Canadian Institute of Forestry in collaboration with Natural Resources Canada. My name is Sharon Young, and I am delighted to moderate today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the lands on which we gather today are the traditional and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands for countless generations. We recognize and honor the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples across what is now known as Canada for their stewardship of the lands, waters, and skies. As professionals in forestry, we acknowledge the diverse cultures, languages, and traditions of Indigenous peoples that continue to influence these territories and their profound connection to the forests, waters, and ecosystems that sustain us. We are committed to learning from Indigenous knowledge and working toward reconciliation and respectful and sustainable stewardship of the land. This year marks the 125th anniversary of the Canadian Forest Service, a milestone that reflects the rich history, evolution, and contributions of forestry in Canada. Through today's webinar, we'll explore key moments in forest history and gain insights from esteemed experts in the field. Before we start, please note a few important house rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. The simultaneous interpretation is available in both English and French. During the webinar, all the participants will be muted with the exception of panelists and hosts. To share a comment or idea with all speakers and participants, please use the chat tool. You can click the chat icon in the Zoom toolbar, which is at the bottom of your screen. A chat window will appear on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type your message. Please post questions in the Q&A function using the Q&A function. A reminder that you may see a red button on the top of your Zoom screen, which indicates that the session is being recorded for archival purposes. If you run into any technical issues, please email us at electures@cififc.org or send us a private message using the Zoom chat. Now let's get started. Our first presentation, 125 Years of Federal Forestry, will be delivered by Jim Farrell. Jim graduated from the University of Toronto in 1975 with a Bachelor of Science in Forestry, and he spent the next 7 years with a BTB Price Incorporated. In 1983, he joined the Canadian Forest Service, where he held various roles in Saskatchewan, Sault Ste. Marie, and Ottawa. He retired in 2011 as Assistant Deputy Minister. Since retiring, Jim has been actively involved with several boards and currently serves as a director of the Canadian Institute of Forestry and chair of Forest History Ontario. Jim, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. We have 15 minutes, folks. It's a relatively short time to cover 125 years of history, so I'll minimize the introduction. I should mention, though, I wrote an article for the combined publication of the Woodlander, Our Forests of the UWA and Forest Canada for a special edition of Forestry, and you should be able to get at that through the OWA website. It gives a little bit more information, but what I'll try to do today is I'll talk a little bit about the past in terms of the Canadian Forest Service, touch on other aspects, I guess, of forestry at the national level. But it is by no means a thorough review of the history, but rather sort of picking up some important points to be able to stay within my time. And I think at the end we may have a bit of time for some Q&A, so perhaps we can cover off some things I may have overlooked or missed. So it's my view that in terms of the federal forestry and specifically the Canadian Forest Service, it all started with the railway. I'm sure those of us that remember our high school history, Confederation, it was in 1867 rather. Manitoba joined the Confederation in 1870, Saskatchewan, Alberta in 1905, and BC in 1871. And Sir John A. Macdonald was the prime minister at the time, and he was determined to build a connector from the far-flung parts of the Confederation, the Dominion rather, in British Columbia through to Eastern Canada. And of course, that was going to be through the railway. It wasn't that long before this where we, as you know, we had a battle with the United States in the War of 1812. And that clearly was very fresh on the minds, interestingly, of our earlier politicians at the time. And the railway was a key element of that. And the second part of that was settlement. And as a result, there was a great deal of interest and political capital spent, as well as financial capital spent, to build this railway. The railway, and in terms of getting the railway built, BC at the time, who had authority over their resources, granted a 20-mile, what they call a railway corridor, either side of the proposed CPR line. A similar railway corridor was again granted to the federal government for settlement across the prairies as well. So there was a great deal of forested land at the time that was under the authority of the government of Canada. In any case, the railway was finished in 1885. Sir John A., determined to see the benefits of a lot of the work that he did in 1886, took a railway trip with his wife, Lady Agnes, and a number of politicians at the time. And I can only just imagine how long that took, but I imagine it was weeks. And Sir John A., as we recall from history, enjoyed a tipple or two. So I suspect they spent the entire trip smoking cigars, enjoying fine whiskeys, and telling lies at each other, while the rest of the passengers, enjoyed the scenery, including his wife. And it turns out that Lady Agnes was a pretty determined woman. By the time they got to Calgary, she insisted that she wanted to ride up front on the cowcatcher in order to enjoy the view of these majestic forests and vistas. And reluctantly, her husband agreed, but directed his chief of staff to sit on the cowcatcher with her just to make sure she was going to be safe. So she spent the entire time through the Rocky Mountains to the West Coast, enjoying the views from the cowcatcher of the train. In any case, the government changed in 1996. Again, there were many scandals that Mr. Sir John A. Macdonald had to deal with. But during that time, after that trip, he commissioned a number of reports in terms of looking at a federal forestry authority. And it was in 1899 under Sir Wilfrid Laurier that the Dominion Forest Service was established. A Dominion forester who was actually a land surveyor, Elihu Stewart, was named to that job. And I think that with a fairly princely sum of $1,000 was the budget of the day. And that was the beginning of the Federal Forestry Service. Just a little aside, Mr. Stewart was actually quite an accomplished businessman as well. He was a co-owner of the Spruce Falls Power and Paper Company in Kapuskasing, Ontario. He established the Canadian Forestry Association in 1900. And at the time, that was a very, very influential organization that had a great deal of influence on growing the early Dominion Forest Service. Interestingly, the source for foresters at the time was really Yale University. There wasn't a faculty in Canada, so those early foresters were recruited coming out of Yale, one of them being H.R. McMillan, which you might recall. He was the co-founder, along with his partner Bloedel, to establish McMillan Bloedel, which was a forest products empire on the West Coast for decades. He got his start with the Dominion Forest Service. So in the early years, as you can imagine, the priority was across the prairies, particularly was fire protection, and the Dominion Forest Service job one was to send out rangers at the time. Dozens of them patrolled the properties that were in provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, as the capacities of these provinces started to grow to take on their own responsibilities for managing the forest. Tree planting, again, was an important priority of the Federal Forest Service. They established a nursery at Indian Head, which was rolled into the PFRA, which is the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, established in 1935. And as you can imagine, the farms were nowhere nearly as large as they are today. In terms of the fields, they were relatively small, and again faced some brutal droughts in the early 30s. So planting up shelter belts to retain soil moisture as well as reduce the effects of wind was an important priority that the Dominion Forest Service was heavily involved in. I just mentioned the Yale University, that at the time, really, the federal forestry branch was really the only organization out there looking for foresters. And in some respects, the demand for those forestry skills was a driver to establish a forestry faculty at the University of Toronto in 1907, another in UNB in 1908. And as you can imagine, as the Federal Forest Service, put foresters out across the landscape in Western Canada into Alberta and British Columbia, it didn't take long for our Western colleagues to realize that they really didn't appreciate, the forestry talent coming from Eastern Canada, from Upper Canada, and UBC established a forestry faculty in 1920. This railway belt or timber belt that I referred to actually became the source for many of the provincial and national parks that we see there today, one of them being Glacier National Park, but there's quite a number of others that had their early beginnings in this reserve that was established to set out the railway. As provinces became more equipped and resourced to manage their resources, the Forest Service migrated to forest research under the Canadian Forestry Act of 1930. In the 1930s as well, the federal government, currently the Canadian Forest Service is primarily directed at biological research from a research perspective, but those early days also included research in forest products. And in terms of contributing to the war effort, there was an interest in the First War, particularly, to look at lightweight but strong wood to build aircraft for the war effort. And this aircraft you see in the bottom right was actually built out of Sitka spruce. Much of that research was done around using spruce for frames of aircraft, was done at the Forest Products Lab in Vancouver at the time. Okay, how are we doing for time here? So I'll get in some points in history I'll just mention, just again, selectively. In 1912, Dr. James Malcolm Swain was named as the first entomologist for the Dominion Forest Service. He was hired in 1912, and one of the reports that he developed at the time was referred to at the time as an intelligence service for pests that threatened these vast forests of Canada, many of which were at the time under the authority of the Government of Canada. And interestingly, if those that know their forest entomology, there is a pest called a Swain jackpine sawfly. So not only was Dr. Swain a manager, a senior manager for entomology across Canada, but also very competent research entomologist in his own right, to the point where he had a bug named after him, which I guess is a pretty high praise. So So the Forest Insect Survey took a number of years, as you can see, was established in 1936 and expanded to include disease, becoming what I think many of us are aware of, the FIDS program in 1952, which carried on essential roles across the country up until the mid-1990s. Budworm also had a major role to play in the Forest Service in Eastern Canada. As a matter of fact, it had a lot to do with establishing the Canadian Forest Service offices in Sault Ste. Marie that was a combination of research facilities from the old insect pathology research lab. But it became a major forest research laboratory, originally built almost entirely around the budworm, but more recently has expanded to other areas of research, including fire and ecology and climate change. So pests have always been a key part of the research program of the Canadian Forest Service, and the other one is fire. And I show a picture here of Herb Beale, who was a pioneer fire researcher. The acronym is the Forest Fire Danger Rating System. Fred's early work provided the foundation for a very highly respected and scientifically based assessment for prediction of fire, rate of fire spread, and it was built on over the decades. And for Fred's earlier work, he received an Order of Canada in the year 2000. I had referred to the Wood Products Research Lab in the 1930s, was established in Vancouver, and originally in Ottawa, the Eastern Forest Products Laboratory, which was later moved to Quebec City. Anyway, those became privatized in 1979 to become Forintech. And in 2007, Forintech, Ferric, and Paprcan, the pulp and paper research arm, were combined to create FP Innovations. Skipping really quickly forward, I think another key moment in the change is faced by the Dominion, by that time was the Canadian Forest Service, was federal provincial agreements where the Forest Service became responsible for what we call sectoral regional economic development. And that was characterized by federal provincial forestry agreements, I'd say in every province across the country. And it provided a culture as well as a skill set change in the Canadian Forest Service that up to that point was unprecedented. Moving forward quickly to the 90s and 2000s, programs expanded. The federal provincial agreement program expired in the mid-1990s, and the early 2000s, we started to see more engagement by the Forest Service in terms of industry innovation investments, which was to a great extent prompted by the decline of newsprint and the challenges around the pulp industry, and not least of which, the challenges around the softwood lumber dispute. Here, moving fast forward to the 2020s, it's interesting that pests and fire are all integral parts of the research program, but now framed in the context of a changing climate where carbon is an important preoccupation. And again, where we started back in the day, planting trees in the prairies, tree planting with the 2 billion tree program is an important part of the Canadian Forest Service program today. So hopefully I have stayed within my 15 minutes, Sharon, and perhaps I could answer any questions later on when you're ready.
Thank you, Jim, for the insightful overview of how federal forestry has shaped Canada's landscapes over the past 125 years. Well, I don't think we have any questions so far, but there is a comment in the chat from Robert, and he's saying this may be covered in the Alberta discussion, but another factor in the Canadian Forest Service history is protection of the watersheds on the eastern slopes of the Rockies that provided the water supply for the prairies. Any comments, Jim?
I'll leave that with Katie. Yeah, no, Robert, you're absolutely right. There are reams and reams of details that as they say, left on the cutting room floor. But no, that's an excellent point. Maybe Katie might touch on that.
That's good. Jim, you can now stop sharing your screen. All right. Next, we welcome Pierre Mathieu, President of the Quebec Forest History Society, who will share great moments of forestry practice in Quebec from 1910 to the present. Pierre, the floor is yours, and I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you, Sharon. The presentation will be in English with my English from Quebec City. And it's an update of a presentation that I've done with Jean-Claude Mercier that anybody knows in September 2020. And it's an update of the presentation. We've called it the Great Moments of Forestry Practice in Quebec from 1910 to the present. So it's a great pleasure for the Société d'Histoire Forestière du Québec to be here today. And I think one of our administrators, Louis Campeau, is in the room. Alors, je te salue, Louis. Alors, si tu as un commentaire ou des questions, tu pourras intervenir à la fin. Autrement, merci. Alors, voici, on peut passer la 18e diapositive, OK? Next. Over the last century, forestry and its practice were influenced by numerous factors, you know. Some came from the evolution of the forest itself, affected by growth, fires, we just talked about this, disease, and human intervention. Next. Equally of importance, the changing socioeconomic condition continuously affected the expectation of the population toward forests and the way it will be used and managed. Many factors combined with the evolution of the knowledge and the science allowed important change in the management of the forest and the practice of the forestry over time. I just want to add that each province have their own law and rule administration of the forest, and that's great. This responds to the land and the people who live there. Next. Forestry will have been in science in 1910 with the foundation of the Laval University School of Forestry. And after that, we have in 1921 the creation under a law of government of the Association of Forest Engineers of Quebec. The main goal of a young organization was to promote the science-based management to the Quebec forest and the hiring of its members, mostly graduated from Laval University in the forest industry that were related to them. And we have celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Ordre des ingénieurs forestiers 4 years ago. Next. Sitting throughout several sources of information, particularly the modern documentation produced regularly by the OMFQ over the period, we present in the next slides a selection of important change that took place in the Quebec forest sector that strongly impacted the practice of forestry in this province. Next. The science-based forestry became established practice in Quebec around 1910. Next. Oh. I think I lost my presentation. I don't know. Oh. Okay. We know the father of scientific forestry in Quebec were Gustave Claude Dumont Pichet and Avila Bédard. He completed a 2-year school at Yale University, Forestry School in New Haven, USA. The picture there have been taken in 1905. And those men, Pichet and Bédard, multiply initiatives both with the government and in education, including the first forest inventory. Next. The development of a global vision of forestry. In 1949, the Forestry Association, Corporation of Engineers Forestiers, published a book, one titled The Quebec Forest Problem. It will address all facets of forestry. This document was well received and most of its recommendations were accepted. It was a great period for forest engineer that time. There was so much to build. One recommendation not implied proposed a continuous accounting in the monetary term of both forest land and stock. Something it would be useful no way today. The brief mark to the beginning of a series of opinion and memoir. Next. Private practice at Earth of Forestry and Inventory Innovation. Consulting engineering firm have been at the heart of the evolution of forestry in Quebec since the first forest inventory were carried out in the mid-1920. Having to adapt to the forest policy, such as the revocation of the forest concession in the 1970s, consultants are constantly innovative, and particularly in forest inventory and photo interpretation. In 1980 and 1990, a consultant office were highly successful in Africa and in Latin America. Next. In 1940, the state assigned the first forest engineer to the private forest by creating the Forest Information Office. Financial assistance program have enabled forest engineer professional service to be offered and to be recognized for their value by many woodlot owners. And you have the picture of Marcel Lotti, ex-dean of forestry, and was well known in the federal organization too. And he defined the professional practice for the private lands. Next. Many of you know the Montmorency forest, the largest teaching forest that we have in Canada. The forest is site of more than 50 years of research and experimentation. And since 1974, we have under successive forest management plans that have gradually increased the sustainable production of wood in full respect of other forest resource use and the conservation of biodiversity. In 1974, the law was changed, and also our forest engineer organization became l'Ordre des ingénieurs forestiers du Québec, and we have to protect the publics, the new organization. Next. In 1975, we have a decision on land use throughout community development, while to the point and timely considering the government decision to close several forest villages in the St. Lawrence River and Gaspésia. And in 1975, a corporation of forest engineers proposed a comprehensive approach to integrate forest resource management to be under a single government authority. But this was not well received. The UFQ was fully involved in the creation of the Canadian Federation of Forest Engineers and the formation of the Canadian Accreditation Office established in 1987. Also, the UFQ and the Forestry Institute of Canada, CFI, have a joint conference in Quebec City in 2012. And also in 2013, we have a foreign conference with the French forestry. Next, polarizing awakening to the environmental consensus. The debate in the late 1990 about the use of the pesticide in the forest, particularly to combat the spruce bottom, not DDT, create a great deal of controversy among the forest engineer. Consensus was in favor of including the use of pesticide as a part of an integrated management approach. Since the ban of the use of a chemical pesticide in forest public in 2001, forest practices have been radically changed, particularly in the area of plantation maintenance. In 1999, we have a big stroke with l'erreur boréale that some of you heard sometimes. And the government placed the Commission Coulomb, who have a recommendation to reduce the growing, recolting of the wood to 20%. Next, it's about forest women. We have about 80% of the forest engineer who are women, but I've been into forestry faculties in Laval 2 months ago, and I think it will change in some years because there's a lot of women are in forestry. Next, forest management has evolved over the past 15 years. Wood production centered from 1950 to 1970. It's moved to the multiple use in 1970, and finally to ecosystem management with introducing in for the Sustainable Forest Management Act in 1913. Next, okay, I will go to the last slide. Who say that in the spring 1924, the government have announced to have a consultation about the changing our regime forestier. And at the end, the Minister of Natural Forest, Maïté Blanchette-Vézina, is proposing a bold shift, concentrating logging in intensive production zone to protect more territory. This project, inspired by the triad culture model, promised to produce more wood on less land, but it's causing some tension with local elected official, union, and First Nation. And for myself, I think it will be, if it's game in the life, will be great. But what will happen with the right to have been given by law in the past to fishermen, hunter, and what kind of mining in the land, in the forest land? That's all for my presentation. You know that also you have okay. Chairman have the past the PowerPoint presentation, also the text that we published in 2021 in the Forestry Chronicles, and we have CHUD QR with 12 questions that you can answer until Friday at 15 o'clock, and I will get all the answer of each. Will complete the questionnaire, and we wait for you. That's all for me.
Thank you, Pierre. One sec here. I'm just gonna quickly check if John Daisley is online. Seems like he is not. We can just jump to Alberta's perspective. We are pleased to have Katie Lamoureux to give Alberta's perspective. Katie is a registered professional forester at Silvercombe, where she focuses on natural resources management through data analysis and strategic planning. Her passion for natural spaces, sense of place, community, and history comes together in her role as president of the Forest History Association of Alberta. Katie, please take it away.
Hey, I just need one moment to pull up my PDF as I was expecting another 15.
Take your time, Katie.
Can't do a presentation without notes, right? All right, I don't know, can you see me?
Yep, I
Okay,
see you.
sounds
And
good.
I can hear you
And
well.
you can?
I can.
Okay, good. All right. And you see in the presentation?
Yep,
Okay,
good.
good. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Katie Lamoureux. I say my name in the way that my husband's family says it. It's not very French of us. And I'm presenting as the president of the Forest History Association of Alberta. And I want to present a story of how Alberta impacted the Canadian Forest Service and the legacy that was left to Alberta. I want to acknowledge the First Nations and Métis who are the original storytellers in the place we call Alberta. For a long time, they've been the richest storytellers, and I hope to honor the past and present day by telling a story of unease and unknown that will hopefully fill us with hope and remind us that we are resilient, like the forest. May we all be committed to respectful and inclusive history, to understand and respect the role that the past plays in our futures, and to walk forward, creating more story with hope and persistent flexibility. So, yeah, my story is going to focus on the Canadian Forest Service's early relationship with Alberta, the transfer of resources, and Ernest Finlayson. The transfer of resources really shook the potential stability of the Dominion Forest branch at the time, although many practical management activities remained in place following the transfer of resources from federal to provincial governance. There was a major shift in who managed the forests in Canada. So there was a time for my more Eastern Canadian people where the Dominion Forestry Branch administrated all of the Northwest Territories, and after Western provinces were created, it continued to administer policy and practical work carried out until the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement in 1930. This was new information to me as I learned forest history, so forgive me if you did know that. Before Alberta became a province in 1905, it was one of multiple Northwest Territory administrative districts. The Dominion Forestry Branch began operating in 1899, and in 1905, Alberta became a province. Nowadays, we occasionally take it for granted that natural resources are under the jurisdiction of provinces. However, until 1930 and the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, there was dual administration of resources in Alberta. So the Dominion Forest Branch was responsible for protection and planting, protection of especially the forest reserves from fire, surveyed and set aside for purposeful management and resource use, and planting of the untreed prairie. The focus on fire prevention was significant. The manpower was not significant. The access was limited. Forest reserves were set apart for particular resource protection and purposeful use. There were many of them. The most famous is probably the Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve that was established in 1910. Early foresters and rangers relied on cabins that were built about 15 miles apart, and some of those still stand today. The average forest ranger had charged over 200,000 acres, and those were estimated to be worth at least $10 an acre for timber. Their activities included ranging on the forest reserves, ranging in the northern expanse side of the reserves, monitoring fire protection along the railway expansion. So I'm really glad that Jim covered the railway because I don't dig into that too much, and it's very important. And as Robert Bott pointed out, the water courses and watersheds were really important as a purpose. So fire ranging was also done along watercourses via canoes and steamboats when canoes weren't safe. And the rangers and the Dominion Forest Branch were responsible for setting up the first campgrounds in the area in Alberta. Around 1903, fire rangers were a temporary job. They were paid $3 a day and provided their own horses. In 1906, there were very few rangers, and there was much concern about the quantity of fire, especially along the railway. In one survey of 240 square miles of a valley pass, 212 were originally covered with dense coniferous forest, and only 33 remained unburned. At the time, there was a total of 34 rangers in Alberta. A quote from Robert H. Campbell. Rangers cover routes of travel as much as 200 miles in length. It must be realized that the district to be protected stretches from Hudson's Bay to the Rocky Mountains, a distance of 1,000 miles, with a width from 300 to 600 miles, and that a patrol of 37 men is a mere handful and utterly inadequate to the task to be accomplished. Resources were hard to come by. In response to criticism, R.H. Campbell, Federal Director of Forestry in 1903, continued to add perspective. The work of the Forest Service of the United States is spoken of in the highest terms of praise and with good reason, but it may be pointed out that, although the extent of Canada is not less than that of the United States, the Forest Service of the United States has an appropriation of $4,640,000 and a permanent staff of over 2,000, while the Canadian Forest Service has an appropriation of $100,000 and a permanent staff of about 40. If Canadian people wish a service equally efficient with that of the United States, they must be prepared to deal much more generously with it than they do now. Fire control fiscal support was reactionary. The following year, 11 more rangers were hired in Alberta, from 34 to 45. As Alberta began to see significant population growth, there came a desire from that population to be responsible for managing its own resources, like the other provinces. Discussions about the potential transfer of resources began in the 1920s. I took a table from a history book that outlined the number of entries to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta over a period of time, and the star is the time that Alberta became a province. So this gentleman struck me. I have a son named Ernest, and so I was quite intrigued at the moment. And then you fit into the story. He is the story, really. Much of the impact of the transfer of resources is under the directorship of Ernest Finlayson, a man born in Toronto. He studied engineering and forestry at the U of T. He worked for the Dominion Forestry Branch on boundary surveys of the Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve. And after graduation, he became inspector of fire ranging. He reorganized fire ranging services in the prairies and Northwest Territories. As district forest inspector of forest reserves in Alberta, he was responsible for the most important administrative unit of the day. In 1920, he was moved to Ottawa as the forest protection specialist. In 1924, he became the director of the Dominion Forestry. And Ernest had become the director of a federal branch which appeared doomed to lose its most significant administrative tasks. Ernest took on a dual role of advocating against the transfer of resources and diversifying the Dominion Forestry branch. This is a picture with him in it. So he diversified significantly into research, I think reluctantly, from what I can understand from the texts. And it was to become a priority of the Dominion Forestry. The Forest Products Laboratory had already been established in 1917, but in-depth forest fire research began in 1926, how fire started and the intersection of fire ignition and weather recording stations were operated by forest officers in the West. The Save the Forest Week began. This photo is from the Calgary Exhibition and Stampede in 1924, which was a precursor to National Forest Week. In addition to his goals of retaining responsibility for forests and while diversifying, Ernest Finlayson was responsible for great strides for management and ranging in Alberta. Significant resources and efforts were put into infrastructure. Lookout towers in the Rocky Mountains Forest Reserves were built. Fire guards for future firefighting were created. Roads to ranger stations were established and trails beyond those ranger stations. And telephone lines were deemed necessary to the watchtowers because if they can't connect to people, what's the point? Those in the text, they talk about them being walked through by moose and being down quite frequently. And they built lots of buildings and cabins. Ernest Finlayson was opposed to the transfer of resources, but had done much, especially with research to buffer the loss of the management of the natural resources. Many of the local employees of the Dominion Forestry branch simply were rehired for similar jobs in the Alberta Forest Service. Johnstone, 1973, said, to say merely that Finlayson had fought hard to retain the forest reserves as national forests was an understatement. He had fought like a tiger, beginning in 1925, almost from the time when he was named director. The federal government was barely 60. I wanted to add some context. So the federal government was barely 60 years old by the time of the transfer of resources. The Dominion Forestry branch was even younger. So this adds some context, I think, to the understanding and the motives of Ernest Finlayson, and from the perspective of the federal branch of employees who had done well by most standards with limited resources. Almost 100 years, so not much more than 60 if you're thinking about it. We're feeling a certain amount of insecurity and unknown, but we all do feel deeply connected to the forests and our sense of belonging in Canada. We've heard a story today of much progress with very few resources. It was accomplished with a fledgling federal administration, and so much was accomplished over 30 years of Dominion Forestry Branch administration before the transfer in Alberta. There was so much positive growth in the face of intimidating circumstances. By the transfer, people hadn't yet experienced the Great Depression or World War II, or many of the following conflicts and stresses. The Dominion Forestry branch's legacy in Alberta was something that made a strong foundation for the future of forestry in Alberta. Many useful tools and infrastructure were in place following the transfer of resources, including locals who were capable of carrying on the work as employees of the province. The knowledge of history can humble, inspire, and comfort us. It can remind us that we're resilient and we have the power to do good things and be good people in the face of intimidation and mistakes. The characters in the story are not flawless, nor did they make choices unworthy of criticism. However, I think we can respect and accept the good that we inherit from those who come before us, and knowing their stories, we can make different or better decisions as we write our chapters. Oh, my bad. I'd like to leave us with a quote from the 1906 Canadian Forestry Convention by Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the then Prime Minister. We are dispersing now. Our labors are at an end. No, I am mistaken. Our labors are just commencing. It is not sufficient for us to say that we have done our work, that it is completed. Again, I repeat, it is only commencing. We have worked as a collective body. It becomes every one of us now to work individually and singly, and I desire every man in this audience, as he goes away to his home and to his own avocation, to become a missionary in the work of forestry. It is not sufficient that we should feel strongly upon this subject. Unfortunately, we have to remember that the Canadian people at large have been too indifferent in the past to it. We must interest the nation, interest the individual, the farmer, the settler, the lumberman, everybody in the great work which is involved in forestry. And I got that quote from a book called History of Forest and Prairie Fire Control Policy in Alberta by Peter Murphy that was published in 1985. And he comments in that book that it is unfortunately applicable to the time period of that book, and I think that it is applicable to our time period as well. So thank you for having this presentation.
Thank you, Katie, for sharing how the Canadian Forest Service has influenced Alberta's forestry sector. It seems that we are still missing John Daisley. He was supposed to give a presentation on early fire detection methods. But the good news is we are ahead of the schedule. So let's take a moment to answer some questions. Okay. So the first question is for Jim. Jim, are you still there?
I am, yep.
Perfect. How has changes in governments impacted Canadian forestry priorities? Comments?
I'm not sure if you're looking for specifics, but it certainly has been my experience that different governments do come with different priorities, and they are in fact felt by the Forest Service. For example, I've referred to the Forest Resource Development Agreements. This was done under a liberal government in terms of just recasting how regional economic development would be undertaken. I mean, with a country as diverse and as far-flung as Canada, with different economies and different income levels, it was a way of redistributing wealth and they took a view of having that regional economic development responsibilities more targeted to sectors as opposed to being handled by a mega department. And there was a change in government in '84, a year after that program was only just getting started. And that government, the new government that came in, was equally as committed to it. I also have, for example, that's sort of governmental priorities. The current government, as you can imagine, is refocused and reinvested substantially into climate change research, and the work the Forest Service has been doing around pests for decades, and fire management to some extent got a somewhat new life in terms of it recast in the context of a changing climate, as well as for example, the fledgling carbon budget model of the 1980s became I'd say a huge public policy tool domestically and internationally. So in the absence of that sort of political support and direction, it's hard to imagine that kind of science would be brought forward to policy use as we see today. And in terms of individual ministers, it's been my experience that yes, individual ministers do in fact have their own interests and priorities. I won't mention ministers' names, but we did have a minister who was extremely focused on, he came from the agriculture department and sector, on what we call international market development. And interestingly, this was in the late 1990s. And even at that time, there was obviously a view that Canada is too dependent on our neighbors to the south as a market for our products. In this case, it was wood products. And the organization pivoted and established market development programs in China, in Japan. We bolstered our efforts in Europe and made early efforts in Korea and India, again, with the view of diversifying markets. So I hope that answers the question, that there are priorities that are in fact felt by the organization, and in some respects have shaped the history of the organization both from a programmatic perspective as well as, I guess, a skill set perspective. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Jim. I think the next question is not a question, it's a comment still for you. Hi, Jim. Not sure if there will be other presentations on the role of Dominion Forest Service fire rangers here in Saskatchewan, but I would like to connect with you about that history and possible records that you may be able to refer me to in that regard. So he left his contact information there for you to, I'll leave it to you to connect with him.
Yeah, okay. I thought Katie did an outstanding job on that, Katie. Congratulations. That was really well done.
All right, moving on to the next question. I think it's for Pierre. Are you still there, Pierre?
Oui, je suis là.
Okay, so the first question for you is, did the Model Forest program in the 1990s and 2000s have an impact in Quebec?
Oh là là. Not now. It was before that you have difficult to answer to that question, because all the forest model have been closed, and if you want to have information about the production of the forest model, all the information is inside of the Service Canadien des Forêts. It's not on internet, So I try to have some report, and impossible to have those reports now. It's not living on internet, just at the Service Canadien des Forêts. So what really is the end? I'm really not sure of that. I'm not aware. Okay.
Thank you, Pierre. Next question for you is from Ira. and he's asking that forestry is evolving due to changes in the forest itself is an interesting point. Can you share any examples or insights into how the role of monitoring changes? For example, forest inventory, fire, or environmental monitoring in Quebec has feedback to drive evolution in Quebec forestry?
You have to repeat the question because it's a long story, you know.
No worries, I'll repeat that. The
Yes.
forestry is evolving due to changes in the forest itself is an interesting point. Can you share any examples or insights into how the role of monitoring change, for example, forest inventory, fire, or environmental monitoring in Quebec has feedback to drive evolution in Quebec forestry?
Yes, just inventory now it more with satellite and LIDAR, you know, and that's really a change. That's an example, you know. If you want to have other example, I will have to look. We have now an aménagement écosystémique, you know, ecosystemic management. So it's okay come word, yeah, and now apply. But for the next generation of regime forestier, I think we will have a law perhaps this year or next year. We will have more facilities for the industry to get their woods, because now there are so many constraints that it's very difficult to recall the woods. Okay.
Thank you, Pierre. Seems like there is another question for you. So it said, hi, Pierre, you spoke about l'aurore boreal.
L'aurore boréale, oui.
Apologize for my French. I'm curious if this is unique to Quebec or if this large-scale clear cutting occurred in other provinces.
I cannot speak about other provinces. Perhaps Jim can talk about this, but l'aurore boréale was one step, and the report of Coulomb will reduce the allowable cutting to 20% was the answer for the government, and we are now there. And with all those fires, you know, we are also reducing the cutting in the woods.
Thank you, Pierre and Jim, for answering the questions.
Well, I can do quickly, maybe just to build on that. I mean, the aurore boreale, as many know, was an interesting phenomenon that it was the forest became a focus of a well-known Quebec personality. And as a result, you know, from the average sort of retail politics perspective, carried a fair bit of weight. In Ontario, there was something called the Class Environmental Assessment, which was undertaken in the 80s, and it was a fledgling piece of legislation designed to do environmental assessment. It was originally designed to do sort of project assessments that we think about today. But for a number of different reasons, the entire forest management program of the provincial government of Ontario became the focus of a class environmental assessment, which went on for months, well over a year. I don't have all the details, but it was a huge assessment of how and, you know, reporting, everything from practice to policy to reporting to accountability, transparency. And it had a substantial impact on forest management policy and practice in the province of Ontario.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, our final presentation will be given by Ira Sutherland and Eric Anderson, directors of the BC Forest History Association, and they will discuss surmounting BC's Great Forest Management Challenge with federal support. Ira and Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much. We're very glad to be here. We have been around for 43 years now. Over to the next slide, Ira. We began in 1982, primarily among industry veterans and the professional forester community. However, that's expanded quite substantially. We're happy to say that we have good representation from around British Columbia and from quite a variety of participants in the forest sector. Next, Ira. It is important for us to emphasize a definition of forest history, a broad one. This is important for raising awareness of what we do and to secure support from the broad diversity of people associated with the forests. So history of uses, management, industries, technology, landscapes, Indigenous peoples, individuals, and communities. I may note that my colleague Ira Sutherland is part of a recent initiative on our part to dedicate a sort of a subcommittee towards Indigenous forest history in British Columbia. Next, please, Ira. Among our activities, AGMs and events around BC, we like to move around the province as best we can. It's not always so easy to do this. We mostly are centered in membership in Prince George, Vancouver, Victoria, but this is an ambition of ours to cover the province as best we can. Publication activities go back a long way with our organization, with both book publications and an ongoing newsletter. We are working with companies and communities and assisting preservation. Just recently, a company came forward to us at an event we participated in. We hope to meet with them and try to also secure the awareness and participation of other companies in the sector as to the value of their archives. Next, please, Ira. A project that we've dedicated ourselves to quite a bit lately is oral history digitization. We have a backlog of old cassette tapes that are stored at the University of British Columbia, which we are setting about digitizing. And these are interviews done primarily by industry veterans during the 80s and 90s and up into the 2000s. There's a lot of work to do, and we're very excited about it. And we're putting together a program for YouTube on Professor Peter Pierce, an important figure in forest policy development in British Columbia. Final slide, I believe, Ira. Our partners, we have had over the recent years directors of our organization representing the University of British Columbia Rare Books and Special Collections, which has a special fund for our organization and activities, and also a director recently from the Northern BC Archives. And both of them have very strong participation in and support for the forest sector history. We also participate in a national project, if you like, the Canadian Forest History Preservation Project. And we just like to spread brochures and spread the word everywhere we go that, look, if you need help, we're here, and along with our partners across the country. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ira.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric, for that overview of our association. And it's my honor to now share a little bit of BC forest history with folks from all across Canada. So I'm speaking to you from my office at ESSA Technologies, which is located in Vancouver and on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. As Eric mentioned, we are a forest history association, not forestry. And we continue to reflect on how we can better tell more inclusive stories of the forests of this province, which obviously includes an incredible and much longer history of First Nations and the forest here. So this photo is actually a photo from right near my office. It was taken 135 years ago, which is a couple decades before the BC Forest Service ever existed. And I can tell you that today the view is very different. It is cosmopolitan. There are coffee shops and a wall of skyscrapers practically blocking the view of those mountains, because that is right where downtown Vancouver is situated. So this photo kind of speaks to the relatively recent history of forestry in the province. And yet we've had many monumental challenges we've faced in forestry. So today I'm going to share a few of those challenges and then focus on what I'm calling the Great Challenge. I'll reveal that in a minute, and try to reflect on some of the lessons we can draw from these past experiences, these challenges, for facing some current challenges we face today. And these challenges we face today are felt in many provinces, obviously. So in BC, we've experienced record-breaking fire years back on back. And we're basically tasked to fundamentally rethink our relationship with fire and how we manage fire. We understand now that although necessary, historical fire suppression has led to a buildup of fuels on the landscape that's now interacting with climate change, and it's creating these really difficult, really tricky fire management situations. In BC, we also hear a lot about old growth forests and an ever-present demand from the public to conserve the remaining old growth forests. This is really tricky as well. You know, old growth forests have provided the province's timber supply for a century and a half. But as a consequence, we're left with the legacy of that we're dealing with today, which is that these old growth forests have become relatively scarce. And so as public demand continues and First Nations are more and more involved in making decisions over forests, BC is currently trying to figure out a different path for how it should manage and steward its old growth forests through time. We also hear about interactions between logging and also fire and flooding. And really there's a broad basket of goods and services provided by the forests that we're still trying to figure out exactly how that fits into our forest management and policy. We've been working on that, a lot of these issues for many decades, and they are tough challenges we're still figuring out. But the big challenge, or what I'm calling the Great Challenge, is what I'll talk about today, is really a throwback in time to BC's challenge of achieving sustained yield across its forest lands. And so driving the need for sustained yield, first of all, the vast majority of BC is public land, about 95%. So the province has a responsibility to manage forests in the public interest. And it's been advocated for over a century, since at least the Fulton Royal Commission in 1910, that the province should manage the forests, targeting a perpetual supply of timber that is at least steady, if not increasing, as a result of advanced silviculture over time. So to tell the story about BC's challenge to achieve sustained yield, I'm actually going to refer to this historical timeline I developed during my PhD that traces 6 major phases in BC forest management. So today I'm going to skip the sort of colonial origins and the expansion of industry, which is all very interesting, and go straight to the period when the Forest Service was created and reflect on how that transitioned towards sustained yield, which was established in 1948. And the 2 key elements of sustained yield I'll focus a bit on. One is forest inventory, and the other is tree planting. And both of these are key ingredients for the province to be able to set an annual allowable cut and actually ensure that that cut is sustained over time. So I showed that photo and I said that BC's a little bit different than perhaps the eastern provinces, and that forestry kind of formalized quite a bit later here. And that timing was actually really influential on BC forestry policy, because in the early 1900s, there was already a growing conservation movement. You know, we had national parks being set up in the US and across Canada. And there was this notion or this philosophy of wise use. And so wise use was really a worldview that saw the forest as a resource that has been endowed upon society. And it was vital that this resource be managed responsibly and efficiently and exploitively, but exploitively at a sustainable rate to ensure that this resource persisted into the future. And so key questions in how to do this were, first of all, how much forest was out there across the vast expanse of BC, and how fast would it recover after it was logged? So towards answering that question of how much forest was out there, the Canada Commission on Conservation, which was established in 1909, undertook the first inventory, or the first attempt to inventory the forest resource of British Columbia. And that report, published by Whitford and Craig, really was a very crude estimate. It really just compiled existing data, existing timber cruises and inventories. It used interviews and performed their own reconnaissance by horseback to try to put together a picture of how much forest and timber was available in the province. And so it's a fantastic resource. It really provides a vignette of different forest landscapes in the province, including on the coast and in the interior. And I want to pause for a second to mention that the Forest History Association of BC recently collaborated with the Canadian Forest Service, in particular Tony Tofimo, to create an enhanced digital copy of this resource, including all of the maps, these large fold-out maps. And that is available on our website under the Publications tab. So Whitford and Craig, they also reported on vast areas of the interior of BC that had been destroyed by fire. And they kind of painted this picture that fire and insect were really, really damaging this resource and were a threat to the success of a prosperous provincial forestry economy. So within this setting, the BC Forest Service was inaugurated in 1912, and it was given responsibilities to conserve, regenerate, and protect the forest from fire and insect. And given the data and knowledge held at that time of forest ecosystems in BC, these responsibilities would not be accomplished easily. So fire was really acknowledged early on as this key threat. A second threat was acknowledged more so in the 1930s, and that was the threat of overcutting forests in the province. So Chief Foresters Manning and Mulholland in the 1930s really urged the need for reforestation and for better inventory of the forests. And so the second inventory of BC's forests was completed in 1937, led by Chief Forester Mulholland, and he painted a really bleak picture. He said that the coastal forests were being overcut at twice the rate they could regenerate at. And he also pointed to mill closures in the Kootenays and on the coast of BC, and said that it was largely due to unsustainable cut rates. So he urged the need for sustained yield and a sustainable rate of cut. And so the new Foresters Act, 1948, officially brought in principles of sustained yield. Sustained yield would be implemented via new tenures set up on public and private land. And of course, success of this implementation would really be contingent on having a detailed knowledge of the forest inventory and also being able to regenerate the second growth forests to ensure that perpetual supply of timber. So regarding the forest inventory, not long after, thanks to federal support, the province was able to complete a systematic inventory of the entire province, mapped at a 1 to 15,000 scale. And this was a huge effort. It included a significant number of field plots, and it mapped every square inch of the province, which is something that really hasn't been done since at a single point in time. Most forest inventories are kind of done piece by piece these days. Well, this was a complete picture of the province's forests, and that would help inform the annual allowable cut in each of these tenures that was set up. I'll take another pause to shout out that UBC, as part of my PhD thesis, and the Forest History Association undertook an initiative to scan and digitize these maps, and you can now access these maps from the UBC library if you're so interested. So I'll wrap this up with a little focus on the challenge of planting trees. And I'm going to do that using some data I compiled during my PhD and a graph I made with that data. So the key message is, just like it took many decades to complete a full forest inventory of the province, it took a really long time to figure out how to plant trees effectively across the province. And so tree planting lagged many decades behind. The reasons are really, it took time to figure out how to do it, how to develop the technical and operational capacity, selecting appropriate species, seed zones, establishing nurseries, and figuring out what kind of containers to grow the seedlings in. So we see this enormous lag back from when the Forest Service was created, really in 1910, and the sort of goal was set. The objective was set more formally in 1937. It was mandated by law in some of the tenures in 1948. And, oh, sorry, I should explain this graph a bit. So the black line is showing us the annual timber harvested, and we'll see that that line goes up quite a bit through time, as you might expect. And then these bars appearing on the bottom are the number of trees that were planted. And ideally, we'd have that black line and those bars line up. So we still continue to see a lag, even long after these sustained yield units were set up. We also see that the amount of harvest increased dramatically with those sustained yield units, because they attracted a large amount of investment and they opened up new parts of the province where there previously wasn't a lot of forestry. Finally, in the 1980s, we start to see tree planting deployed at scale. And it still took several decades until the 1990s around here before the number of trees planted actually caught up with the amount of wood that was harvested. And so this lag, or overcoming this lag and finally catching up, was really supported in a large way by a federal fund provided in 1980, and that was continued and then supported by the province from 1986 to 1995. And so part of the story here is that it just took throwing a lot of money at this to make it finally happen. So a few takeaways. BC, like all other provinces, has faced many challenges over its past century and a half of forest management. And one of the great ones, or one of the ones that has certainly received a lot of attention from the forest history community, was the challenge of implementing sustained yield forestry. It was confounded by questions such as how much forest was out there and how do we reforest post-harvest. So BC experienced these lags that often lasted for many decades, from when goals were set to when they were finally put into motion and accomplished. Overcoming those lags was made possible to a significant percent by federal support. So federal support in terms of providing knowledge and also funding to help get things moving. And so I guess just generally, when we think about these challenges we faced and the long legs, it's kind of provides interesting perspective to think about some of the challenges we face today. We face challenges about needing knowledge and figuring out how to do things, but sometimes we also kind of know what we need to do. We just need to throw the resources and set them as a priority to overcome them. So thanks to the association and fellow researchers, and thank you all for your audience today.
Thank you, Ira and Eric, for the valuable discussion on the historical challenges and support for BC's forest management. Well, our last speaker, John Daisley, will discuss fire detection in the 1920s. John is currently retired, but during his career, he has worked as a government logging inspector, power saw operator on a road location crew, regeneration surveyor, logging supervisor, skiller, safety and environmental coordinator, and road construction supervisor. However, his primary role was as a planner with Saskatchewan Forest Products Corporation, McMillan Blondale, Saskfor McMillan, and Weyerhaeuser. John, over to you. Yeah, you can play from start.
Okay, can you hear me now, Sharon?
I can hear you. Would you want to put your presentation in the presentation mode?
Yes.
You can play from start. There we go.
Okay. I'd like to begin far back in the history of the CFS with some quotations from the 1914 report of the Director of Forestry for the Department of the Interior. In particular, an excerpt from the report of the District Inspector of Forest Reserves in Saskatchewan that was contained within that larger report. The inspector said, "In the northern and mountainous section of the provinces where the settlements are new, fires are very numerous due to the fact that the settler cares nothing for the damage done by a fire, so long as it burns over his quarter section. He usually starts the fire when there is a high wind and everything is very dry, without any pretense at fire guarding or otherwise confining the fire. If the settler would take ordinary precautions in burning, 75% of the fires and loss therefrom would be eliminated. It is a very simple matter in this country to either plow a furrow and backfire, or simply backfire when conditions are favorable around the area to be burned, and then start the fire against the wind. This method will give a far better burn than starting the fire with the wind, and there is practically no danger of its getting away if a small amount of precaution is used. The result more than counterbalances the extra time it takes to make the guard. In the spruce belt from Green Lake to Hudson Bay Junction, approximately 4 million feet, it should say 400 million feet of merchantable timber has been destroyed by forest fires in the last 7 or 8 years. There was far more than this amount destroyed in the northern and western areas, which are not included on account of lack of definite information." So included in that 1914 report were some pictures of fire towers across Western Canada. Some of the settled areas of the province were quite modern, such as the Steel Tower, pictured here, located at Roblin, Manitoba. Most of the towers in the north, however, were built of native materials. This picture from the Pines Forest Reserve is the most unique that I have come across. Most of the towers were built in the backcountry of logs obtained on site or in the nearby forest. The design and the construction of the towers was left up to the local ranger, who sometimes passed that responsibility off to an assistant or the fire crew. In the Big River history book, Arnold Fonis reported on the construction of fire towers in his area. His account states, "The devastating fires which swept the country in the early 1900s were a prelude of what was to come unless some kind of control could be maintained. The Department of Natural Resources soon began constructing fire control towers at approximately 50-mile intervals across northern Saskatchewan. This distance was chosen to assure that radio contact could be made between towermen. The height of towers varied between 35 and 100 feet. They were constructed of either wood or steel. The first fire lookout station in Big River District was a temporary structure situated on the hill overlooking the town. It was soon abandoned when a more adequate tower was built on Bodmin Hill, 6 miles east of Big River in 1926. And that's the picture we're looking at now. This tower was a wooden construction, and although it was only 35 feet high, it was built on the highest land in the district, about 300 feet above the surrounding countryside. The little room on top of the tower was glassed in on all sides, offering an uninhibited view in all directions of many miles of forest and lakes. The equipment in the tower, as in all other towers, consisted of a fire finder, two-way radio, and a pair of field glasses. Excuse me. With his powerful field glasses, the towerman was constantly scanning the terrain. When smoke was sighted, he turns to his fire finder and takes a bearing on the fire. The fire finder is a disc-shaped apparatus mounted on a turntable. It is very simple but adequately constructed with a peep sight and a hair sight. With the finder centered on the fire, the exact degree of azimuth can be determined. The towerman next contacts the nearest tower by two-way radio and asks that towerman to take a cross shot on the fire. The intersecting point of the two finders determines the location of the fire after it has been plotted on a map. A report is sent immediately to headquarters, and men or equipment are sent to the area as soon as possible. This means of detection greatly reduced the number and severity of forest fires in northern Saskatchewan. Early towers were built primarily of wood and were relatively short-lived. In most cases, the platforms on top of the towers were open to the elements and occasionally could become very uncomfortable for the person on watch. As these wooden towers decayed and became unsafe, they were replaced by steel structures with a small mini-windowed house or cupola at the top. Here's a fire tower under construction. You can see it's being made of native material. And here is a wooden tower being pulled down. And these are the remains of the tower after it hit the ground. Aerial support for firefighting soon became part of the program. In 1927, J. Smart, inspector of the Forestry Branch, Department of the Interior for the province of Saskatchewan, announced that the Forestry Department would increase the efficiency of its fire protection by using aircraft. It was to be a cooperative venture. The Royal Canadian Corps of Signals would provide the essential radio communications. The Royal Canadian Air Force would supply the aircraft and personnel. 2 Vickers vedettes and a Vickers Varuna would be based at Ladder Lake to support forest fire protection, while 2 more vedettes would continue with photographic work. The aircraft patrols would fly defined routes to detect fire outbreaks in the west and central parts of the province. Flights out of Cranberry Portage in Manitoba covered off the east side of the province. Normally, routes would be patrolled daily unless rainy weather or high fire hazard conditions dictated otherwise. The forest rangers who once paddled the northern water routes patrolling for fires now remained at their headquarters, manning the towers, training crews, and relying on the RCAF flying boats to patrol, detect fires, and transport firefighting crews. Basic patrol work was carried out with small Vickers vedettes, single-engine biplanes that chugged along at 130 kilometers per hour. They were slow but dependable and met the short takeoff requirements required for forestry work. The small flying boat was designed by the Canadian Vickers plant in Montreal specifically to meet Canadian forestry requirements for a patrol aircraft. The hull was made of elm and covered with cedar planking. The wings were constructed of wire-braced wood. Although they could carry 3 people, the low-powered Vedette normally carried just a pilot and an observer. The crew sat exposed to the weather with the pilot just below and ahead of the engines, which were suspended on the top wing. There were no mufflers on these early airplane engines, and they were very loud. The observer sat in the front cockpit and braved the elements. He had the best seat in the house, with an unobstructed view to the left, right, straight ahead, and straight down if he cared to lean out that far. The Vickers aircraft that were available were well liked by the RCAF personnel who used them to fly the forest patrol routes and the aerial photography surveys. They were, however, too small for transport work in northern areas. So this is the Vickers Vedette flying out of Ladder Lake on a forestry patrol in 1930. And this is the twin-engine Varuna. At the RCAF's request, Vickers designed and built a flying boat capable of transporting men and equipment to forest fires. Vickers enlarged the Vedette model and made it into a twin-engine heavy hauler. They named it the Varuna, and it was capable of carrying the pilot and as many as 7 passengers. During times of high fire danger, it would remain on standby at Ladder Lake, ready to transport men, equipment, and supplies to a water landing nearest the fire. Despite the second engine, the Varuna was still underpowered, and when fully loaded was limited to flying from larger bodies of water. The Vedettes were equipped with wireless radio transmitters. As they patrolled, they radioed the location of fires to ground stations, and within minutes, the Varuna could be airborne with a crew of firefighters. If the fire was near to the base, it took a local standby crew. For fires further afield, it went to the fire ranger nearest the fire and picked up firefighters from that area. The Varuna also carried another innovation, small gasoline-powered water pumps, which were transported to the fire area with the crews. The fire rangers and firefighting crews were also provided with 2 canvas panels, 6 meters long and 1 meter wide. The canvas panels were used to signal to the patrol aircraft to bring more men and supplies or advise the pilots on when to pick up the fire crews. Early in the 1929 fire season, the complement of planes assigned to Ladder Lake consisted of 3 Vedettes, a Varuna, and a de Havilland Moth. As the Varuna had not yet arrived, and the ice was still on northern lakes, the Moth was equipped with skis, and a Fairchild was brought in from Winnipeg and also equipped for fire suppression on skis. Despite being small and low-powered compared to the airplanes that would follow, the Fairchild immediately became popular with the RCAF pilots and with private aircraft operators. The Fairchild was designed with a heated and enclosed cabin and increased load capacity. It had excellent forward visibility as well as low rear cabin windows. The Fairchild could easily be converted from wheels to skis or floats, which made it very attractive to aviators in the north. In August of 1930, the Ladder Lake Seaplane Base took delivery of a real workhorse for the transport of firefighting crews. The newly designed Vickers Vancouver was built using entirely new concepts. The Vancouver had greater power and a steel hull. It carried 10 men and equipment and could fly higher and faster than the Varuna. It was a great improvement in transportation for fire suppression work, since it could easily take off with a full load on lakes which even the little Vedette could not take off from. In the fall of 1930, at the end of a particularly bad fire season, Flight Lieutenant Apps, the commander of the RCAF Ladder Lake Base, closed the door for the last time. The federal transfer of control over natural resources had been finalized on August 1st, and the province was taking over. The base would remain open under provincial control for a number of years, but the official RCAF designation was terminated. So this ends my presentation on early methods of fire detection by the predecessors of the Canadian Forest Service. Thank you for your attention.
That was an eye-opening presentation on early fire detection methods. Thank you, John. So now let's move on to the questions. And we also have a post-webinar survey for all the participants to fill out. Just one sec here. So there are 2 questions in total. You may need to scroll down to see the next one. So in the chat pod, we have a comment from James Farrell. He said, great presentations today, folks. I just thought I should mention that although Atlantic Canada's perspective was not specifically covered in today's talks, the Atlantic provinces played a significant role in Canada's forest history and the Canadian Forest Service. Lots of federal research installations and involving forest products markets and industries. Thank you, James. And there's one question for Katie. Katie, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Here's a question for you. Do you know if there was any consultations with First Nations prior to the creation of forest reserves in Alberta? And if not, when did the impact on treaty rights started to be considered in FMA licensing in Alberta?
Okay, so I will start off by saying I don't know everything about forestry. I think that the most important thing in my slightly uneducated stage of life compared to some of my peers is that I have to learn how to research things. So I have done a little bit of quick research in the from the sources that I have in front of me, but I'd like to say that I don't know of any purposeful consultation, but I do know of the opposite of that happening in especially the Rocky Mountain areas. In particular from this guidebook, which is a really cool one. They talk about the Moberly family and other Métis families being evicted from Jasper National Park in 1910 and completing a over 2-month-long journey to the Grand Cache area. Sorry, 2-year-long journey to the Grand Cache area with all their things. And then I did a little bit of quick clicking around and research, and I don't know when the impact on treaty rights started to be considered in FMA licensing in Alberta specifically, but I did find the Government of Alberta's First Nations consultation guidelines on land management and resource development was adopted May 16th, 2005. So I don't think that these are things that we would consider deep history or mid-history. I think they're a little bit more current events. These changes in attitudes and desires to not write people out of stories. So yeah, I don't know the answers, but hopefully those are a couple of places you could go to discover some for yourself. And I think one of the hardest things about being interested in history is that somebody else has written it for you and not necessarily for the purpose of answering your specific question. So it takes a lot of digging, a lot of extrapolation and interpretation and patience. So good luck with that. And hopefully we will be making better changes to that and cataloging more stories. That is a goal of the Forest History Association of Alberta. We have a website that I shared on my screen that doesn't have any stories published on it at the moment, but the goal is to capture some forest history stories in the area. We have lots of photos, so you could browse the cache of those. And of course, like what we're doing now will be history one day, right? So yeah, I guess keeping that in mind when you're recording things and doing things yourself, trying to make strides and make changes in the industry.
Thank you, Katie. Before we wrap up, I just want to quickly remind everybody that the recording of this webinar will be made available soon, and we'll post it on the CIF Open Access e-lecture webpage. And if there are no more questions, I would like to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you all for participating for this special webinar. We hope today's discussions have provided meaningful insights into Canada's forestry history and the role of the Canadian Forest Service over the past 125 years. Also, a huge thank you to all our speakers for their time, expertise, and incredible contributions. Have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.